Welcome to the Hedgineer podcast with your hosts, Michael Watson and Jhanvi.
And welcome back to another episode of the Hedgineer podcast. I'm your co-host, Michael Watson.
And I'm your other co-host, Jhanvi.
And this is the show where we talk about technology, data, and more often than not, AI within asset management and hedge funds. And so we generally start this off with a week of what's new. JV, what's new in AI?
A lot. I mean, I feel like there's a lot that's new with us. We've been onboarding a lot of new people. We've been moving offices. And so I think that with the new members that have been joining our team, specifically on the engineering and product side, I can already start to feel myself getting time back. And so honestly, I would rather talk about the things that we've been working on in terms of the new things that we've been talking about over the past couple of weeks. Because I feel like we spend so much time talking about the things that are coming out, but unfortunately, sometimes we don't have the time to actually try them out. And I think this week we have two really good things that we've been working on, fiddling around with on our own. So that's kind of what I was hoping to cover in the beginning.
Sure. What do you got?
So I finally tried Fable for the first time. I did not try it when it first came out and then got taken away. I just didn't have a good use case for it. But when Fable came back, I was actually in the middle of an interesting project, so I thought I would tag it in to see how it works. And so to give you some context, we've got this very large training session coming up with one of our clients on Claude Code. And we've done Claude Code trainings in the past, but they've usually been either a mix of technical and non-technical people that are interested in using Claude Code, but not actually full-time engineers, or B, a really small, close-knit group of engineers that are operating within one or two kind of code bases. This training session is really new and different and exciting for us because it's the entire engineering organization of a very large fund. It's somewhere between 150 and 200 engineers globally. And it's a fund that's been in operation for over 15 years. And so they've got a lot of legacy systems, lots of code bases. And we essentially have to train and teach the team how to use Claude Code, many of whom have not used Claude Code ever. So really exciting, mildly daunting. And I had this idea where rather than going through the traditional PowerPoint where we talk about ideas and then have these mini demos, since everyone in the room is an engineer, what I had the idea to do was essentially build a small dummy repository, like an API suite for let's say a portfolio risk engine, and then have a series of training sessions that iteratively teach the team how to start using AI more and more thoroughly and autonomously, where the first session walks you through how to write a really good API builder skill, and then have Claude Code actually use that skill to build a new API. And then have Claude Code then evaluate the efficacy of that API by building unit tests, right? Super, super simple ways to start using AI in a very hands-on way. Second session, we start going over automation. So things like using sub-agents and having an API builder agent and having an evaluator agent and having these automatic kind of processes that run through loops and goal setting and essentially go through the exact same API building demo again with these new concepts. And then the third one would be complete automation, where you essentially package everything into a plugin, you deploy it into a brand new repository, and you kind of show how all of these best practices and hooks and rules and everything that we've built out over the past two sessions now automatically gets deployed into a brand new code base and how you can start using it very, very quickly. That was the idea. And so last week, I spent a couple hours kind of fiddling with Opus, going through this idea and having it essentially take all of our Claude Code training material and strategically organize it into these three sessions, come up with ideas for the demos, and how we could intelligently and strategically weave in these core ideas into those demos. For example, rules, right? The idea that Opus came up with was in session one, after you have the API building skill, and then you build the API, create a rule or a hook that essentially prevents the agent or Claude Code from modifying schema files that it shouldn't modify, right? For example. And so I thought that it did a really good job. And I basically ended that session with 3 markdown files, one for each session, with really good details on what the slide deck should include, what the demo should include, and what the code base should include in order for those demos to run successfully. And that's basically the place where I left off when Fable came back online. So over the weekend, I basically uploaded those 3 markdown files and had Fable first go in and actually read all of those files and flag any discrepancies or inconsistencies between the sessions. Like, for example, if demo 1 alludes to a specific code base API suite and then demo 2 has something completely different, like that's a hallucination that I'd like to catch before we actually go in and start building out this code base. I think it did a good job. I think that it was able to thoroughly find inconsistencies. I think my only gripe was that it was so verbose that reading the content that it gave back to me was almost as arduous as me going in and doing it manually. I don't know if you used Fable before.
I have.
Do you experience, like, I just feel like the amount of content that the tokens that it throws back at me is just so much more than if I use these other models. I don't know if it's because I'm using Claude Code and it doesn't have the memory of what I've been doing in cowork, but I just feel like it just gave me so much back that I didn't need. And it was really difficult for me to sift through.
Yeah, like I've found that I haven't spent like a full day just on Fable, that I need a very hard problem where I need a lot of reasoning and verbosity to think, like have the model think through the complexity of the problem in order to get the most out of Fable. Otherwise, it's bringing like a bazooka to a sniper range, and it's just too much power, and it's trying to overfit. But if I think you need a problem where there really is a tremendous amount of complexity in order to get the most out of Fable. Otherwise, it's actually can make things worse and definitely more expensive.
Yeah, I totally agree. And that's why I didn't use it the first time. Like, I actually didn't have a use case. And that's also why I feel a sense of skepticism when these new models come out and like the entire engineering community starts like, I don't know, becoming incredibly excited and hysterical over it. Because when I actually read through the use cases that people have tried, like, for example, someone on Twitter was like, oh, I used Fable to one-shot prompt like a 3D rendering of Hogwarts, right? And I'm like, that's cool, but like that's not my job, right? Like that would never be applicable to the things that I do. So it's really difficult for me to assess whether or not these new models are actually good based on what the engineering community builds on day 1 and day 2, because it's just like random crap.
Right.
You know?
What if your job was to build a 3D model of Hogwarts?
That'd be great. That'd be super great. You actually know that'd be terrible. You don't have a job anymore.
Well, sure, but like the one person that figures it out first could probably like, oh, let me create a SaaS product out of that, and you one button press Hogwarts UI. But I think that it
just doesn't resonate with me. I'm like, this is really cool, but like this doesn't really help me understand how much better Fable is at reasoning.
Are you? But I guess like
just the larger
question I could push back at you is like, are you thinking about big enough problems then? Like, are you thinking about problems that are grand enough in scope such that Opus falls down and Fable is able to pick up where Opus fails? And so does it actually force you to think about different types of problems that are grander that you maybe didn't realize were attainable in previous versions?
Yeah. But I think that the capabilities of what Opus can do significantly starts expanding once you start building a more intelligent and thoughtful context layer, which we have, right? So like when I compare my experience with Opus and Sonnet with even our clients, right? Like this morning I was teaching one of our clients how to build a skill for the first time. And obviously since this is her first experience, she doesn't have any other skills. And so working even within a Claude session, like on her laptop with her account is wildly different than me using Opus on mine, because I have skills that codify the way that I speak, the way that I think, like the way that I put together PowerPoints and like the way that I put together markdown files. And like the content that I get back is so much more in line with what I would do manually because I have this context layer. And so I think that you're right, but in my day-to-day tasks, like I don't think that there's a single time that I have wanted to do something with AI and be like, nope, Opus can't do that. Like either I build a skill, maybe the process to get there is more complicated where you either need to build an agent or do something a little bit more thoughtful in how I'm prompting the LLM. But I've never had a problem where I was like, Opus couldn't solve it. Even this one where I tested Fable, the next thing that I did was actually had to go in and build this entire repository. And it not only built the repository for the main API suite, it also built the repository for the skill library plugin. And then it also built a second repository for that last session where once you actually package everything into a plugin, you want to demonstrate that you could easily kind of export it and download it into a new repository, like going through that entire thing. So it was even able to pick up that, oh, you need a completely separate repository for the third session. Did all of that really well. And then I had to go in and put together all of the PowerPoints for all 3 sessions. And that was not something that required a lot of reasoning because the Markdown files had very clear, like slide 1, title, content, speaker notes, content, slide, like it had everything that it needed. So there wasn't a lot of reasoning involved. But with Opus, I see a lot of formatting errors in how it builds PowerPoints. I see a lot of like just wonky outputs. Building PowerPoints is something that has always been a little bit tricky with AI, at least for me, even with the skills that I have. Fable did a fantastic job. Like that was the one thing that I think Fable was able to do where I was like, oh, I see a very significant difference between Opus and Fable.
Mm-hmm.
You know?
I see a difference in the cost. But
I didn't look at how much all of this costed me. I'm gonna take a look at this later this week.
Yeah.
But
it's kind of interesting. We're like when we're looking at costs, it's not Fable that's exploding because everyone can use it, and I think we're pretty good with not abusing it. It's not a default model for anything.
Because we're like everyone on our team is thoughtful about AI. So I think that a lot of the problems that other companies have around people running rogue with AI doesn't happen here because like we're us.
And there's really good delegation between like deep thought on an Opus and then delegation to subagents in Sonnet and a good balance between the two. And so I think that once you have that, to your point, in good context, that the need for the machine gun to come in with Fable isn't necessarily as needed. But my only concern when I think is like, oh, are we not like trying to do hard enough things?
I don't think that. I don't think that at all. No.
Yeah. But getting at the cost, like where I see the biggest explosion right now is in Cursor. And especially in Cursor consumption-based usage. We have some power, like our biggest power users now are all kind of gravitating towards Cursor. I think they have some awesome UX. And that's where I see like the most amount of increase in usage. And it's not just increase in, it's actually not in the token consumption where it's exploding, but it's actually in the cost per token. So like we're using more premium tokens, I think, in Cursor right now, where we're using a lot of Opus to do a lot of design decisions and a lot of looping where there is the orchestrator that's observing the loop, thinking through problems, and then delegating to Sonnet. But it seems like internally right now, the most sophisticated workflows that we have with looping are actually happening more so in Cursor than in Claude Code, although much of the inference is still going through Claude for the most part.
I think that makes a lot of sense. Like I took a break from using Cursor just because I wasn't working with code bases as much, right? So like if I'm putting together like marketing material, I'm not going to open up Cursor. But I've been working on the new like website and also a couple of other things in Markdown. And my default browser or my default kind of system for opening Markdown is Cursor. And so I've been using it a lot more these past couple of weeks. And like the user experience is just so much better. I forgot how much better it was.
Yeah.
It's also faster. Like Composer way faster.
It's
and it's good. It's great.
Yeah,
so
100%. And so like opposed to doing an Opus, and I think that's where you get the like Cursor really shines. You still use Opus for your reasoning and thinking orchestration loop.
Yeah.
But then opposed to going to Sonnet, switch to Composer 2.5 and it's just so fast. And so when you're using the actual coding execution, by using 2.5 versus Sonnet, there's just a huge leg up that you get on inference speed within Cursor that you don't get within Claude. And
Have you looked at our spend coming from Claude Tag? Because we turned that on recently, and I didn't realize this was a difference between Claude Tag versus the original kind of Claude Slack app. Claude will respond to threads even when it's not explicitly like added, right? So like I see it messaging in threads all the time, which I think is like good. Like the content that it gives back is usually interesting and right and insightful. But have you?
We have it. So we get it. Like I think most people that came out with Claude Tags get a free like $10,000 up until maybe the end of July or August. And so I was looking at it today. We don't have a ton of spend, but I see it definitely increasing in terms of like usage, especially when it auto replies. And you can start controlling a lot of that. And we can kind of touch on, I wanted a deep dive today on how Claude Tags work. Because you think it's Claude for Slack, but it's not. Slack is just the first implementation of Claude Tags. the expectation in terms of how they've designed the product is that Claude Tags just means at Claude, and you're going to be able to do at Claude in many different applications. Slack is the first one, which is why you call it Claude Tags instead of Claude for Slack, because the way that they've even designed the whole product suite within Claude.ai, you could see kind of where they're going with it.
Wait, tell me more about how, because I don't even know how we configured it.
Yeah, so there was originally the Claude Slack app, which is like a normal app. You can at it, and then it'll do work. And so we use a lot of apps right now within our Slack environment. We'll use at Linear for like going and building and managing Linear tickets. We use at Cursor for like doing changes within Cursor. And Cursor, I think, out of the box is the best coding agent Slack integration without changing anything. One of the things that's great is it does like the auto reviewer, where it'll like actually implement a feature, do a screen capture, post it back to the channel. It's like, oh, not only have I made the PR, here's a view of the change actually working for the application in a local browser. And then there's Claude, which has a lot of capabilities. But what Claude's now done is they've taken that first V1 of Claude, the app, and turned it into Claude Tags. And how essentially that works is if you go to Claude.ai and you're an admin, you can see like Claude code and then configure Claude configuration. You can see Claude Cowork, you can see Claude Chat, and then you can see Claude Tags. And within Claude Tags, that's where you can configure how Claude, when you mention it, works within different applications. And so to start with, they added Slack. And what you can do within Claude Tags, I think, are really special. The first are bundles, where you can bundle applications like Fireflies or Linear or other enterprise applications like Salesforce, and give a Claude tag in a specific channel access to API capabilities. The second thing that's included in a bundle are plugin. So you can say what plugin skills you want to include within this bundle. The third is access to, I think it's like URLs that you can permission Claude to go and hit. You can also permission a specific context for that Claude app. And there's one other one. It's going to come to me in a second. And then you can label that bundle. So like we'll label our bundle. The first one we have is like Hedgineer products, where it'll say like, all right, this bundle gets access to this project within Linear to be able to read and write issues. It also has access to Fireflies conversations that we have on Zoom or in Teams when the product group is permissioned to be able to see that meeting within Fireflies. We give it access to our Hedgineer plugin for products. So that's like how we think about product design, how we triage tickets, how we think about prioritization for features, bugs, who it should get routed to, and specific context around this, these skills that we can say like just within this channel. And that's where you can control like, hey, don't always reply unless you're like, it's very clear that they've either said Claude in the name or there's an at Claude. Otherwise, don't reply. Or you'd say, hey, be super chatty. You reply to everything. Only reply in a thread. Don't reply in the main channel. So like you provide context for that bundle when it's used. And then what you can do is you can match a bundle to a channel. So you can go over to like your Slack channel, you connect Slack, and then you could add a channel that you want this Claude tag to be available in. So we'll have like Hedgineer product is like where we talk about Hedgineer product. We also have one feedback. We then will add that bundle to each one of those tags so that then when you go at Claude, or when you go and add the Claude tag to a given channel within Slack, it has access. When you do like at Claude, you ask something, it has access to those tools. It has access to those URLs that you've whitelisted. It has access to the plugins for product whenever you're talking to it, as well as it stores its own memory that's going to build up over time.
Can one channel only have one bundle at a time?
No, a channel can have multiple bundles.
So when I at Claude, how does it deduce which bundle to kind of invoke?
Great question. What's happening behind the scenes is all it is a Claude code session running in remote. So when you actually go, like, that's kind of the really cool thing. Like everything that Anthropic's doing since like the beginning of 2025 is
Just Claude code over and over.
Claude code and rebrand it. Claude code and add a plugin and call it, this is Claude or for finance. Or Claude code, remove the word code, add the word co in front, and just don't allow anyone to be able to see what they're doing, and call it Claude co-work. And then when you want to add Claude tags, what do? You just take Claude code, put the word tags on, and don't even show them the code at all. Like you don't even see what it's doing. You're just seeing the output in a Claude tag. And this is very obvious they're doing this is because when you see a response from a Claude tag in Slack, and you go to like open session, it opens up a session that's read only of what Claude's doing behind the scenes in the Claude code web viewer. So like it's not even rebranded when you look at the session, it's just Claude code. So getting back to your question of how does it know what plugin to use, it's the same thing that happens when you're using Claude code. It looks at what is the front matter of the skill, what's the description, and then Claude makes a determination within the agentic loop of whether or not it's going to read in those skills into context or not.
Does the bundle have like a trigger, like context around when it should be invoked, similar to how a skill has a trigger?
No, it just puts in the skills into the skill front matter into the context, the system prompt of the context of each message, and then Claude determines what to do.
Got it.
So in the same way, like the MCP tools have like the description and context around it, skills have context around it, plugins are just injected into context. And I think all Claude sees is like the plugin name, colon, skill, and then front matter of the skill associated to it. So that's about it. You do want your plugin names to generally reflect the context around it because those tokens are being read in. But yeah, that's about it. And so that's what Claude tags are. What is kind of cool around that is that it allows you to permission different channels to different tools and different access and different skills based off of what you want Claude to have access to within that channel. So it can, like in the product channel, it just has access. I talked about like that for the Fireflies, for the product group, just this one linear product channel or linear product group, so it can't see anything else. Oh, and a GitHub repository. Sorry, that was the other one. Is you can decide what GitHub repositories it can have access to. And either you see code bases, or you can use GitHub repositories for context and memory and knowledge. And then you can go to another channel that maybe that is just me and like us two. And for this, maybe we want for this, we want both of our Fireflies, put it all in. This where's where we can talk about like sales and other concepts that like Claude within this session has access to all the Fireflies that are in the sales channel. It has all like what is like our CRM have for prospective deals. What are the skills associated to the way in which we want to do sales. Maybe this also has access to email to be able to read in emails as well. In the permissions between those two Slack channels of what Claude can see are based off of the configuration of the Claude tag within that channel. There's also ways that you can configure like what is the default set of permissions that Claude has, and so Claude can have in all of Slack some basic skills and then sub Slacks access to other things. But yeah, it's a whole kind of like ecosystem around all Claude, starting to create the concept of asset bundles, which are tools, skills in the form of plugins in this case, GitHub repos, specific context, and then reference these bundles in different Claude tags, and then have these Claude tags associated to associated channels. And then have that be a concept that they're going to roll out outside of just Slack. But it's not, one of the other things I found interesting is it's actually, the connections aren't over MCP in this case. A lot of connections for third-party tools when working with the Claude code ecosystem on like formally designed tools have always been over MCP. In this case, the tools are not MCP. They are natively API calls that have a corresponding API key and secret. And so, and I think it makes sense in the context of it's not authentic. When Claude's doing work within a Claude tag for a Slack channel, it's not doing work on behalf of Michael Watson anymore, which is what happens when you go through an OAuth process and you authenticate with a third-party tool with MCP. So that this third-party tool says, oh, you're Michael Watson or you're Jhanvi. And it then can manage the permissions based off of Jhanvi or Michael. But when Claude is running as a tag within one of these channels, it's neither one of us. It is almost its own entity. And by associating an API key that you can permission and scope based off of what that system that the API key is giving you permission to, it starts to represent its own entity that is distinct from either one of us. And MCP via OAuth doesn't really have that concept. You would need to have an equivalent like authentication mechanism that adds an API call as well. Then once you add the API key, you can still use MCP totally fine. But everything Anthropic's done with MCP has all been through the perspective of OAuth, and that identity is almost always an individual user. And so there's now starting to allow for as a first-class citizen, third-party authentication as primarily going through API keys, that it's like a transition towards how you want to manage authentication more for an agent than for an individual user. And what we see them doing is moving away from MCP and more back to traditional APIs with a well-scoped API key that represents a specific user.
Yeah, which I think makes a ton of sense. Like going back to the point that you had last week or maybe the week before on how these hyperscalers are making it more and more, I don't know, plug and play to start building and shipping and running these agents on a remote server. Like those agents shouldn't be authenticated as a single person at the company, right? Because that person has some access, some not. And so this makes a lot of sense. Does this route through the managed agent service that Claude has, or that's completely separate?
No. So unfortunately, it's actually separate. So Claude CMA is Claude Managed Agents. And that is a separate runtime through like Claude Platform versus Claude.ai.
Yeah.
And there's a lot of drawbacks from that. One of which is how you distribute skills. And so Claude Managed Agents has their own skill API for like making skills accessible to Claude Managed Agents. And I don't believe they allow you to reference plugins within CMA. It has to go through Claude Managed Agents, whereas within Claude Tags, which is using Claude Code Remote, natively supports plugins, but right now doesn't allow you to use the Claude Skills API. So when using these two products that are almost identical in terms of how they're operating from like even a pretty technical perspective, somebody under the hood that's actually working on the products, like, oh, they're actually very different. They're from a technical person's perspective, not just product, they're almost identical. They have two separate APIs, and the integration between the two seem to be pretty disconnected. I'm assuming in the same way that like we have a general belief that Claude Cowork and Claude Code are eventually going to merge. The same thing will happen with CMA and with the concept of Claude Tags. Like those will merge as well. Because from somebody that's like we're actively building on top of all of these things, having disconnected functionality for systems that feel as though they're almost identical or functionally the same within the same organization's suite of products is obviously suboptimal. Like you get it, they're moving quickly, a lot of different teams. It's difficult to have everyone coordinate together. Maybe they should have a Fable orchestrator running product. But yeah, it's they're not connected yet, at least.
Yeah. Okay, cool. On that note, let's take a quick break and then get back and talk a little bit more about the main topic of this episode, which is some of the org changes that we've been going through around forward deployed engineers at the company.
Yeah.
Something that I hear pretty consistently from executive leaders in the space is that they see value in AI, but there's no clear path to actually adopting it. Most providers, whether it's the frontier models like Claude and OpenAI, or the platforms being built on top of them, they hand you a product and they leave you to figure out whether it works for your workflows and how. And at Hedgineer, we take a very different approach.
And we're able to because we have industry experience to not just understand investment process in the abstract, but to know how a fund actually operates, where information is sourced, how it moves through a team, what synthesis happens before a decision gets made. Once we understand that, we can build custom connectors in a data platform that connects all your data directly into Claude or OpenAI. Bloomberg, your primes, your internal models, your internal research notes, whatever you're actually using.
And then we deploy our platform on top of that. Think of it as a command center that sits on top of your Claude or OpenAI account. You can see every agent at your disposal, both the personal ones that you've built for yourself, as well as the org-wide ones that are maintained by your company. You can ask them to do things on demand directly within the application, or you could schedule reoccurring tasks that have them running in the background and having them send you the results straight to you via Slack or email.
And we also track usage at the firm over time, so leadership can see where AI is working, where it isn't, and surface opportunities to go deeper.
And we run training sessions with your team on Claude, on the platform, and even how to prompt and build skills better. So the competency builds internally and it sticks over time.
So if you're interested in learning more about how we can help your fund become AI native, shoot us an email at info@hedgineer.io. There's a lot of complexity within the enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
And you need a person in order to understand all of that complexity. And that person needs to be technical enough in order to transform that complexity into a common abstraction layer that is some sort of like software system in order to get leverage out of that system. And there's downsides of that. One of which is that organizational complexity oftentimes has nothing to do with engineering. It has nothing to do with software. It has to do with the complexity of the industry that organization operates within. And they then have complexity in their software just because their operating model, their business is complex. And so translating that into software is also going to be complex. And then figuring out how that software and that system works and translating that to a common abstraction layer, which is maybe a third-party platform, is complex. And so who do you need in order to manage that complexity? In 2022, you needed an engineer. Like you needed somebody that can at least speak the language of the system, be able to also be personable and speak the language of the business as best that they can, and have them be the bridge between these common patterns and abstractions and the complexities of a domain in a vertical.
Yeah, I think that's true. I also do think that the forward deployed engineering model was really successful in a world where AI was very good at code and not much else. Like when Claude Code came out in 2024, and engineers were able to start building, customizing, modularizing software very quickly because they knew how to use AI. I think in that world, the forward deployed engineering model makes a ton of sense. Actually, I think it's even stronger, right? Because you can abstract away a very, very bare bones skeletal version of whatever software you want to sell. And then you just have each engineer work with individual clients or users to use Claude Code or use Codex, use AI to just start customizing that software to their specific needs much quicker.
Yes, but I guess that what I was going to get at is figuring out what those needs are requires an element of domain expertise that, depending on industry, might take years to acquire, that you can't speed run through with AI. And so there's always the challenge of having an engineer that has a completely different pedagogical background. And by that, I mean, they went to school for engineering, or maybe they went to school for like an economics, but they spent a lot of their time learning how to code. They didn't spend the last 10 years of their professional life going really deep on industrial names, understanding supply chain, understanding the actual physical engineering of different manufacturing plants, and understand some complex geopolitical situations. In addition to understanding like all of the gap principles of financial modeling a company and industrials, spend all this time talking to management teams, learning industry lingo, and all of the complexities associated with being a analyst or PM within the industrials world, as an industrials PM, for example. And so using a forward deployed engineer that, yes, they can code very quickly and they can say things that sound pretty smart, but having them intimately understand the workflow of somebody that's had a completely foreign experience from them I've lived it, very fucking hard to find people that can do that, and they're unicorns. And I mean that in a true sense, unicorns. I've worked with thousands of engineers over my career, specifically within hedge funds and asset management. I could think of 5 or 6 people that actually could do that well. 5 or, and like true unicorns, and all of them made at least $1 million a year. Mm-hmm. And it's not like they're that easy to find. Because if you could find them, like they would all be working there. They even struggle with finding it. And so you can't run a business dependent upon unicorns. With AI, it allows you to do it a little bit differently, where why are you trying to hire the engineer that could speak the domain? And instead for us, we hire somebody that understands the domain and use AI to understand the engineering component.
I think that your point about the unicorns is really interesting, because I never really thought about that. Like when you're working in a really large organization, engineers are successful in an ecosystem of a lot of other players with a lot of different domain knowledges, right? Like product is helping with things like building really strong user experiences and building products around sophisticated user journeys that resonate with the business stakeholders. You've got these like people on the front office side, or the clients, or whoever your end users are, that are highly vested in providing good quality feedback to you, because you're all part of one team and you want to succeed, and the success of this project looks good for everyone, right? You've got these like, you got managers, you got a lot of people that are helping kind of steer the ship and turning a loose idea or a loose problem into a solution that actually works. But when you take an engineer out of that ecosystem, how many of them could wear all of those hats and actually understand the context of the business well enough, not only to build that in isolation, but also then work and interface with like very senior stakeholders at these clients that are paying literally paying the company all the money that they need to keep the lights on. That is so unreasonable to expect out of the average engineer. Yet when you go on LinkedIn, or you go on like, I don't know, any of these job posting sites, you see hundreds of job descriptions for forward deployed engineers. And I think that dissonance is the reason why so many of the clients that we've spoken to that have tried working with some of these forward deployed engineering, AI consulting, AI software, AI deployment implementation businesses have grown so frustrated, because this concept of forward deployed engineering was sold to them in this very high esteem of like, oh, we can configure this software for whatever you want. Everything will be very specific to you. You'll get on-site resources that spend all of their time working on your account, like for a fraction of the cost of what a full-time employee would be. And like all of that sounds so great. But then in practice, someone shows up at their door, has absolutely no idea what the first kind of workflows of research really are, like what the fundamentals of any of these verticals are, and are just expected to take problems and solve them, which is kind of insane.
Yeah. I mean, it's also like expecting the client to be able to articulate their problems in a way such that it is it's well enough outlined for a technical and engineer to be able to interpret what they actually want when that's never been a skill set that that person on the other side has ever needed to hone before. Like an example, like where I'm working with the CFO of a large asset manager, and they have a complex post-trade system. They maybe have like 40 different fund structures. Each one has like complex like LP structures and side letters. They're trading across different asset classes, maybe a dozen different counterparties and primes, like many different complex asset classes. Some are structured, some are not structured. The way in which they strike a NAV on a daily basis is dependent upon funds. The fee structure of each one of these funds could be very different. The systems in which are being integrated are very bespoke and industry specific. And when the CFO is explaining the problems, like, yeah, I just need to get this Excel file populated by the end of the day. And right now it breaks down all the time. And I need to be able to make sure that this is the right number. And it comes from this system over here. And a person that's actually familiar with that problem knows all of the things that she actually is not explaining right now because she's assuming that you know. Like, 'cause she's been doing this job for 30 years. I don't know, 20, 30 years. And so there's all of these built-in assumptions that they expect other people, that their peers understand, or that their peers will very clearly say, I don't know what you're talking. I don't know any of this, and they'll never even bother explaining it to you. But when you put yourself in one of these trusted positions and you're saying like, hey, like I'm a forward deployed engineer focusing in asset management or finance, the expectation level of the client on you to understand their problem is so much higher than anyone expects the first time they go into that situation. And it's not just true if you call it a forward deployed engineer, it's also true for in-house engineering. And so if you're like, I used to work at a large multi-manager fund for a very long time, the expectation of most non-technical people within the organization, portfolio manager, risk, even somebody in like accounting or finance, has on an engineer within the organization to really understand the fundamentals of the business is far higher than what that engineer even remotely understands. Like, we used to hire some of the best engineers from Meta, some of the best engineers from Google, best engineers like Netflix, like at the time, like OpenAI, like really, really smart people. They don't know anything about the actual complexities of running a complex multi-manager, let alone like a relatively simple single manager. Like, if you're just like, all right, well, we get the end-of-day positions from the fund admin. If somebody works within a fund, that sounds like so obvious of what it means. We get it from the fund admin. But then if you don't know what a fund admin is anymore, you have to say, oh, well, what's a fund admin? It's like, well, the fund admin is a third party that is actually the official books and records of the of our positions. Like, oh, okay. So like I will go for them to understand what the actual pricing of an instrument is. And so like they're the official source of that. Like, well, they're not actually the official source. We send them the pricing or we set up the feed. The official source might be like Bloomberg, or we send them the mark-to-market price at the end of the day. Like, okay, well, their official source of where the trades come from, right? Like I go to the fund admin. They're the ones that are getting all the trades. Nah, not really. We actually send them the trades via either the OMS at the end of the day or our accounting system. The actual two things reconcile against each other, or it goes against, maybe we have like a shadow NAD system that something like our cesium runs. I'm like, oh, well, what's our cesium? Wait, what is shadow NAV? Like, well, first let's explain NAV. Well, NAV is the official net asset value of the business. That's what the fund admin has. Well, what's a shadow NAV? Well, the shadow NAV is actually something that we also produce. It's a net asset value that we use to shadow and reconcile across the business. I'm like, oh, okay. So now I kind of understand that. But let's take a look at what the prices are for the shadow NAV. So like, show me all like the stock prices. I've seen tickers. No, we actually don't trade stocks. We trade maybe stocks, but we do it on swap. And so for that, we have to understand a little bit more of like what's the swap execution facilities that we have and like what's our exposure and margin to each one. There's not really a mark-to-market price on a per instrument. Like, okay, well, what's a swap? What's a swap? And then what's a swap execution facility? And then at a certain point, the hard part of being an engineer within asset management and a hedge fund has nothing to do with technology, because the actual technology, for the most part, is relatively simple. The complexity is actually in understanding the business and how all of these systems fit together. Because I just talked about a very small component of a post-trade workflow. I didn't even touch anything associated to research. And most engineers don't appreciate nor understand that until it's too late, maybe 1-2 years down the line, when they realize, wait a second, I just joined a job in an industry that technically has the word engineer in it, but it has nothing to do with engineering in the way that I thought engineering meant. Like, I thought engineering meant code and databases and systems and distributed systems and high availability, like algorithms. No, in this case, engineering primarily means process engineering, business engineering, understanding organizational structure and the flow of information through it. And then eventually you get to a point where you're abstracting that out into software. You eventually do build engineering systems, but that's not where you spend the majority of your time when you're actually an engineer within a fund or a forward deployed engineering role. You spend your time dealing with all of this complexity of the operations of an asset manager or a fund, and then trying to figure out what the right abstractions are, and then what are the right engineering solutions for those abstractions. And to be honest, the best people to do that are not engineers, because their entire pedagogical background has been, how do I build software? How do I understand how to build classes in Java? How do I think about distributed systems? How do I think about CI workflows? Or even the people that are more applied engineering, they'll think about product design, or what's a really good application development? How do I think about testing? And they'll complain oh, we didn't even talk about testing in college. We didn't talk about really good application and product design in college. I'm actually a true robust engineer, where I'm not just focused on C++ and algorithms. I think about things at a higher level. And that is not what I'm talking about at all. What I'm talking about is what is the actual way that you can do reconciliations on a shadow nav in a nav system? Again, this has nothing to do even about testing or the more higher level concepts in engineering. It has nothing to do with engineering. So one of the realizations that I've come to is that the best people, if you're going to have a forward deployed person, shouldn't have their primary educational background in engineering, because that's not even the most important problem. They should actually have their primary pedagogical and educational background in the actual business problems that they're looking to solve. And then if you're going to use AI for anything, have AI enable them to be able to build the bridge between that and the abstractions of a core platform. And then have your true engineers be focused on that core platform component, making sure the integrations from a systems perspective and a cloud perspective and a deployment perspective work correctly. But the person that are bridging the complexities between the business and all of the cruft that they accumulate over years and the complexity that they inherently have to deal with when they're dealing with financial markets, which are just abstractions on information that they're ingesting from the outside world, and figuring out ways of how they can organize that information into processes and systems and methodologies to be able to abstract some alpha from that information, arbitrage it in some way, monetize it, service their customers, and continue to do that well enough to keep the lights on. That's got enough complexity in and of itself. And so having somebody that inherently has worked in those roles before, so for our forward deployed analyst, it's somebody that's worked at Citadel as a TMT analyst. It's somebody that's worked at a credit desk working on due diligence for credit deals. It's somebody that's been a fund accountant working on accounting workflows and post-trade complexities, that also lives and breathes in AI. We work with them very closely to make sure that they understand exactly how our platform works. They understand how we think about skills, how we design agents, how you design connectors, how you think about hooks, how you need to be able to structure that in a way so that the thing that you know really well, which is understanding TMT workflow or understanding a post-trade cash settlement workflow, that's where your edge is, that you can very clearly customize your understanding to the nuances of each one of our clients. Do that in the form of a skill, and then have that skill sit on top of a common layer for how those skills are shared, how they're evaluated, how they're tested, how they're deployed, how they're shared. and have that be where the customization of forward deployed happens, and not through the customization that an engineer might build some bespoke system for, because that is one, relying a lot of on that engineer's ability to understand your business, but it also is relying on the scalability of that bespokeness.
Yeah. And I feel like that under the forward deployed engineering model, I feel like our engineers were not reaching their full potential either, right? Because they're good at the things that you were describing. And I feel like at that time when the engineers were the ones that were driving the deliverables for what needed to be built for our clients, you and I were spending so much time being that bridge between the client and what they actually need and want, and the engineer and what's being implemented, that like it was just like not scalable. Like we only have 24 hours in the day, and that will never expand. And so I feel like we hit a very hard ceiling to how far we could scale as a function of the 2 of our time, right? And so I think that now with this idea of having people that have worked as research analysts embedded in the research desks of our clients, working with them to figure out what their problems are, solving them strategically, has been a huge unlock, because it not only enables our engineers to get very clear requirements on what needs to be done, but it also frees them up to do the thing that they do better than anyone else, which is improve the quality of our product and our software, I think, incredibly. And I also think that the other thing that has been very advantageous, and also something that we've strategically and intentionally capitalized on, is the definition of what that deliverable is changing in our favor. Because 2 years ago, a client might want a dashboard, they might want some kind of automated data ingestion job, and then they might want some kind of automated report that's generated an email to them. And those are all different implementations of problems that exist within the space. But now everything can kind of converge at agents and skills. And you can have an agent that either builds a dashboard, you can have a skill that walks an LLM through how to compile a risk report. You can have an agent run a risk, like an automated data ingestion job, and write to Databricks. Like all of those things are possible. And so now, to your earlier point about how the expectation of clients to answer what they need is unreasonable, now that you have these research analysts that are doing that translation, and also working in a world where defining the problem is as good as building the solution, like this now starts becoming this very powerful flywheel for continuously pumping out these custom deliverables in a very consistent form. And then the engineers just have to focus on doing the thing that they do really well, which is building a really good system in which these agents' skills can start being distributed across teams, change over time, improve over time, and kind of continue to grow.
Yeah, and have an observability layer that watches all this happen, identifies how things can get better. Because the observability layer unlocks like, hey, is the forward deployed analyst defining skills in a way such that the client's using them? Mm-hmm. Are they defining skills when you can see that the model is getting confused or there's ambiguity there? Are there actually exceptions when there might be a call into a Python script within the skill that's causing an error on a consistent basis? Observability auto-detects and can fix that as well. And so it's not a silver bullet, but after building software within like this industry for, I don't know, a couple decades, it is the best option amongst all of the options on the table. And we can talk, like you can always try to hire a unicorn, and hiring unicorns is hard if you actually know what a unicorn is. And like that, like when I say unicorn, I mean like an engineer that is exceptional at building product, incredible communicator, deeply interested in the domain in which they're working, in which case I work in a world of primarily fundamental longshore, but also had a lot of like experience and credit. They understand capital markets. They understand nuances of different sectors. They want to read Ks and Qs. They're interested in risk models. They are intrinsically also good at being able to understand the relationships to those. And they can also fly when it comes to building out product. Like they're either incredibly strong within a back-end stack. Oftentimes that's going to be within the Pi data stack, or they're really strong, potentially front-end developers, and they can just whiz. But like after working with thousands of engineers, I can name maybe 5 of them that I think are a true unicorn that would excel in this type of role. And each of them makes at least $1 million a year. Like it's true. And I mean a unicorn that if you want to have a forward deployed engineer that can truly like accomplish the things that I think that our clients expect them to be able to solve, with a level of nuance and domain, like they're incredibly rare. So figuring out a system that doesn't depend on unicorns. And I think that's like pretty much every business model. Like if you can figure out a business model that doesn't depend on all unicorns and can just find people that are like exceptional at what they do, like they're incredible, but they don't have to be the best at everything. That is where I think you can build strong businesses. And for us, realizing that we can rely on a forward deployed analyst opposed to a forward deployed engineer allows us to be able to better segment domain context within the analyst and then building systems within the engineer, and lean on the analyst to lean on AI to be able to do that, that connective tissue between platform and the business much more effectively than an engineer leaning on AI to build a connective tissue from the engineering to the complexities of the domain.
Yeah, that kind of leads me to the question that I wanted to ask, which was, do you even think a forward deployed engineering model can ever be successful? Because to your point on the unicorns, I hear that. But at the same time, I think there's also an element of the bounds through which you need to understand the business start expanding in a world where everything is customizable. Like, for example, I used to work on the sales side and we were building SaaS software. And so one of the nice perks of being in that seat, especially in the front office of a large bank that's selling to these hedge funds, is that I did work with a lot of engineers that fit the bill of what you're describing, where they're fantastic communicators. They really understand the business. Like everyone could understand and explain to you the way that funds interact with fund admins and order management systems and portfolio like that was our job. We had to know all of that stuff. But every team had their own specializations. Like, for example, I worked on a team that specialized in portfolio analytics and factor risk, right? And so research was something that was outside of the bounds of what I knew at that time, right? And so not only does this unicorn, quote unquote, need to have all of these skills, but then they also need to be incredibly fast at learning new concepts and picking them up to a level of fidelity that the client can't notice. And I would go as far to say that finding that kind of person to also sit in a forward deployed engineering seat is close to zero. Because if you can do all of those things, you should probably be running your own business.
Mm-hmm.
And you probably want to be running your own business. If you can do all of those things and you've kind of flown through all of those, like you're probably not going to want to be someone's forward deployed engineer.
Yeah.
You know?
I think in the scenario where there's a very well-defined scope and problem space, where the re-implementation of a piece of SaaS software looks and feels the exact same over and over and over, you start productizing it. And so there really is just a configuration problem at the last mile or some small customization.
Like a solutions engineering or an implementation engineering?
Exactly, yeah. Where like
Databricks, for example, like they have someone that helps you configure the environment, but it's not like a completely custom build out that engineer is responsible for.
Yes.
Yeah.
And the expectations now that some users have with AI and the need to be able to get really deep in the weeds, at a price point that's not completely unreasonable. Like if you're able to say like, hey, let's sign like a $10 million contract, you can throw enough bodies on that and a forward deployed engineering role to be able to figure something out. Mm-hmm. And so like when you're a Palantir like model and you can have very large ticket size, you can start small, but you have like an expectation of a pretty large ticket size, you can start having that level of specialization within an engineering organization that can kind of start coloring outside the lines. But if you don't have an incredibly large ticket size and you have a very large problem space to be able to solve, like a forward deployed engineer is not going to be able to operate in that because they're going to be stretched too thin, too much design space, and they're going to struggle to get any sort of traction with understanding the domain in the limited amount of time you have in an early engagement with a client to be able to build trust, demonstrate value, especially when that client has a very high level of expectation of your ability to deliver at a very good pace. It's a very complicated environment to throw an engineer into. So if you can solve for some of those things in terms of the product side, that like you limit the design space that the engineer has to operate within, or you're able to give enough budget to throw a lot of bodies onto the problem, then the forward deployed engineering model definitely makes sense. But as you start going into slightly smaller ticket sizes for a client and larger design space, that having the forward deployed engineer having to bridge that gap almost on their own with limited amount of resources, and that gap is the context, is going to fall apart. So instead, if you have that problem, you can do smaller ticket sizes, you can have larger white space, but you bring somebody to the table that already has all of that context in their mind, pre-tuned, because that's what they've been doing for the last 10 years. And then you have the bridging to the platform. That's where you lean on AI. And you can define a lot of skills up front for like, oh, this is how we think about skill development. This is how we think about agent development. This is how we think about agent connectivity. This is how we think about agent sharing. This is how we connect your agents to your Entra. This is how we deploy on GCP, AWS, Azure. That can all be pretty much skillified. You don't need the engineer for that. But what you do need, especially in a world where there's a large design space, somebody that already has taste pre-fine-tuned into their wet GPU, which is their mind. And that is not somebody that comes from an engineering background.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice for people that are considering working with a firm that does have the forward deployed engineering model. Like, I think a lot of people go into these types of engagements with the assumption that it's very similar to SaaS, where they are going to come and solve the problem for you. But really what you need to do in order for that engagement to be successful is you need to very clearly define the problem for them.
Mm-hmm. And with that, let's call it an episode. So that's a wrap. Again, I'm your host, Michael Watson.
I'm Jhanvi.
And we are the Hedgineer podcast. We push on episodes every week. You can follow us on Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts. Check us out on Instagram, TikTok, Twitter, LinkedIn. And until next episode, we will see you later.
The Hedgineer podcast releases episodes weekly on Tuesday. Our hosts are Michael Watson and Jhanvi. The Hedgineer podcast is produced and edited by Aaron Free. Follow us on your social platform of choice and reach out to us at podcast@hedgineer.io.